Yeah, like that's ever gonna... Wait, this isn't a parody account. It's from one of the creators' actual Twitters. It's not no, it's not even close to April Fool's Day. It's November. Are they actually doing Clone High Season 2? What? The first episode got leaked online. How does that happen? Whatever. I already know I gotta watch it. Okay, this is fine. There was that episode for that Johnny Test reboot that ended up scrapped when the final product came out and was totally different. Maybe this is like that. Alright, the first episode was exactly the same as the leak, not a proof of concept at all. That's fine. We're fine. It's all good. They're getting back into the swing of things after 20 years. I get it. This was never gonna be a totally smooth transition, but hey, that second episode was much better. Not great, admittedly, but there's a decent base they could work off, and people who got early screenings are saying it gets better. Oh god, those were straight ass. I don't know what... Oh, those cheeky... Oh, I get it. I know what you're doing. This is all a farce, isn't it? You know, that's why everything is gradually getting so much worse. They know what they're doing, and they're gonna make it more apparent as they go. I knew it. I knew that's what they were doing. These episodes are unapologetically insulting to the original series. I can't wait for this to all come around. I'm not picking up on the sarcastic edge to it all yet. Maybe it's a little too subtle to catch on a first watch. They're probably gonna need to point it out when the curtain gets lifted. Getting a little close to the finish line here, guys. Still not seeing the satire, but these last two episodes, oh boy, they're gonna be like the funniest, most subversive TV I've ever watched. They've gotta be. There has to be a meaning behind all this. The creators haven't supported a bad project yet, except for the times that they did. That's it? That's Clone High Season 2? That was just a huge load of bullshit! And you know, now that I'm thinking clearly, it doesn't make any sense for most of the season to be terrible only so they could reveal it was all part of the plan from the beginning. Not as long as that intentionally bad content isn't entertaining. That's the equivalent of pissing yourself in public, getting laughed at, and then smugly remarking how you live rent-free in everyone's heads. Intention loses all meaning when the outcome doesn't express it. Not that Clone High Season 2 goes for that approach in the first place. I'm just saying as much to explain why my coping was ultimately in vain. But then again, a lot of you guys probably don't even know what I'm talking about, so let me break it down real quick. But before I go any further with that, I'd like to tell you about this video's sponsor, CookUnity, the first chef-to-you delivery service offering fresh, restaurant-quality food already prepared for you to enjoy. The way it works is that culinary chefs from all stripes and varieties work with CookUnity to create the tastiest, widest range of pre-cooked, naturally resourced meals possible that can be shipped in only a couple days. All you need to do is pick out your meal/diet preferences, select anywhere from 4 to 16 sets weekly, and it'll come straight to your door, ready to be served with just a little time in the oven, or if you're in a hurry, even the microwave. Personally, I decided to go with meat dishes, which you can see the info for when they come up on screen. But if I had to pick a favorite, it'd probably be the adobo flank steak from Chef Anat Armoni, which featured steak that was juicy but firm, with a tangy orange sauce to balance it, soft fresh broccoli, and a nice paprika potato. But that's just one of several great meals I got with CookUnity. And if that wasn't convenient enough, if you ever want to skip a week or pause your orders entirely, you can. So if it sounds appealing and you want to get in on it, you can go to cookunity.com/juststop or click the link in the description below and use my code JustStop50 to get 50% off your first order of CookUnity meals to try it for yourself. Thanks to CookUnity for sponsoring, and on with the video. Clone High was an animated comedy satire TV show about the clones of famous historical figures going to... well, you can take a guess. Releasing back in 2002, the series was mainly created to lampoon, at the time, popular teen dramas, with each episode making fun of a common, very special episode trope for its perceived lack of sincerity and overt emotional manipulation. Beyond that, though, the series was also sharply written whether you knew what it was satirizing or not, so despite lasting for a single season of 13 episodes, the show retained a devoted fanbase over the years that's consistently yearned for a second season since its cancellation. only being held back from that possibility by two major problems. One, the series wasn't very popular during its initial run, and two, if the series was gonna come back, they'd have to find a way to address what got it cancelled in the first place, the fan-favorite character and popularity-obsessed party animal, Gandhi, whose portrayal didn't sit well with the entire country of India. Now, in hindsight, having newer information about Gandhi, portraying him as a fun, innocently mischievous little guy probably wasn't the least charitable interpretation they could have gone for. But before we knew all that, at the time, it was a big deal. There were hunger strikes outside MTV, the network got threats that they'd lose their broadcasting license if they kept airing it, and I don't know if you're aware, but India is kind of a big country, so not viewing this underperforming show was worth the hassle. MTV decided to stop airing the series before it could finish in America, and ever since, it's sort of been stuck in a limbo, hearing there might be a season 2, but then it not happening over and over again ad infinitum. However, there was always that hope it would find a way to beat the odds, and the biggest reason for why was that whenever the possibility of a revival was mentioned, it was by the creators themselves, who'd sort of made it their life mission to get the show revived, seeing as it was their first joint creation that, when it was cancelled, they still had a lot of ideas for. Their names are Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, as in the Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs 21 Jump Street Lego Movie almost directed solo a Star Wars story Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Phil Lord and Christopher Miller. Those guys. Yeah, believe it or not, Clone High was their first collaborative efforts, and they've never forgotten their roots. So when it finally got announced that the series was coming back as an HBO Max original, for sure it was shocking, but more than that, it was gratifying knowing that Lord and Miller, after all this time, had seemingly built up enough street cred to make it happen through sheer force of will. Or that and a massive, unprecedented spike in popularity the series saw after a couple memes introduced the show to a whole new generation. But regardless of how it happened, the 20-year wait was finally over. Our prayers were finally being answered. Now the second season is just finished up as I'm writing this, and I gotta say, I don't just enjoy it, I hate it. I hate it so much. I honestly didn't think I was as emotionally invested in this series as others were, but this second season made me genuinely angry. And actually, while we're on the phrase second season, am I gonna be the first one to point out that almost no one's calling it that? Like, that's what it's supposed to be. Clone High Season 2, the long-awaited continuation we've been begging for. But then you look at the top search results for Clone High reviews and everyone's calling it the new Clone High or the Clone High Reboot. And unintentionally, I think this is actually a great criticism of the season that we've all subconsciously made without realizing it. I mean, after all, referring to something as a reboot implies that any previous continuity, characters, or story have been discarded, so the same general elements of the property can be used to create a new one. And that's what Clone High Season 2 is. Something that reuses the same character designs, setting, and music to give the outward appearance of Clone High, but everything else has been completely rearranged to do something different. Something worse. They might call it Clone High, it might look like Clone High, it might sound like Clone High, it might even taste like Clone High, but rest assured, this isn't it. And before you ask, no, this isn't about Gandhi. By God, I miss the guy, but his inclusion or lack thereof wasn't the determining factor behind if this was gonna work. He was a big part of the series, but I can understand leaving him to a couple references after he got the series cancelled. Really, it's the characters who are here that I've got a problem with, new and old. In fact, each one represents a different issue I have with the show as a whole, so that's how I'm gonna format this video. One section for each character and the issue they rep. Let's fucking go.
Way back in the 1980s.
Starting off strong, this is possibly the most important element that Season 2 messes up. How so? Remember 5 seconds ago when I said that Clone High is a satire of teen dramas? Go ahead and wipe that from your memory, since Season 2 has decided to drop that main driving force of the series entirely. Or I guess the better way to put it would be that the writers knew what satire was at some point, but they've lost any understanding of how to write it, and I'm hardly exaggerating either. During research for this video, I looked at multiple interviews with the new showrunners, trying to get a better insight into the thought process behind these decisions. But surprisingly, in regards to this tonal shift, it wasn't them that ended up explaining this change, it was Lord and Miller, who, when talking about how their writing evolved by doing other projects after Clone High, stated that one of the main things they learned was the importance of emotional sincerity and caring about your characters, since, at the end of the day, you have to love your characters, and you need to find ways to have sincere emotional moments in the midst of all the jokes to really care. And under plenty of circumstances, I could totally see where they were coming from with this kind of thought process. It's a statement that holds a lot of water when you view it in the context of 21 Jump Street, Lego Movie, or Into the Spider-Verse. Films that, while hilarious commentaries on the works that came before or inspired them, also had characters you rooted for during their adventures. You felt an emotional connection to them despite the elements of satire they contained. But that's just it. It works in those films. When you apply these same words to Clone High, it doesn't come off as smarter or a more enlightened decision. It's a statement of pure ignorance about how the show operates. As far as character drama went, it was never about that. Clone High wasn't a series that tried to get you genuinely invested in these characters and their struggles, coming back week to week to see how the story would conclude. It was a satire of series like that. The whole thing was created to take the piss out of teen dramas that repeated cliches, condescended to the audience, and pretended to care when everything they created was so clearly cynical. I don't understand how you could miss that. It's reflected in every element of the show's presentation, mimicking those very elements to mock them. They'd make fun of the forced lessons teen dramas tend to have by setting them up in a similar way only to subvert them. Joan pretends to be a guy so she can play basketball, but she misses the first big shot that everyone focuses on, then she gets the second. Abe gets people to stop mindlessly hating Gandhi for having ADHD by shifting their hatred to thinking he's gay. You get it? They're anti-lessons done to poke fun at overused, obvious morals that teen dramas kept doing over and over at the time. They even had a specific gesture, the hands of sincerity, that they'd repeatedly use to make fun of how over-dramatized these situations were. And the genius of it all was that Clone High aired on MTV, same as several of the very shows they mocked, which meant they had the same resources at their disposal to make it seem all the more authentic. They could use licensed music for what you'd expect to be emotional scenes, as teen dramas from the time did, only to not take it seriously, adding to the comedy. They could bring on celebrity guests only to not hype them up and put them in hilarious situations. Marilyn Manson is reduced to singing a song about the food pyramid. Tom Green comes in to give a message about treating ADHD people with respect, but he runs off mid-sentence from being distracted. Mandy Moore shows up as a random hobo who happens to be attractive. And these cameos work on multiple levels in that it doesn't matter if you know them or not. All you need to understand is that they're famous, but they aren't treated that way in the show. You don't need any prior context or excessive exposition. On the one occasion Clone High did do that, they made it into a joke of its own, constantly referring to Ashley Angel from O-Town as Ashley Angel from O-Town, additionally making several jokes about how oversaturated boy bands are, to the point you don't know the individual singers' names, you just know the bands that they belong to. It was all incredibly tongue-in-cheek from beginning to end with no room for interpretation. But hey, maybe I'm the dumbass. Why else would the season 2 writing team take these elements seriously and proceed to use all of them as wrongly as possible with Joan at the forefront? See, she's sort of swapped places with Abe as the main character this season, having all the fake drama centered around her relationships and therefore being the one that gets or delivers all the anti-lessons. But here's the goof, here's the funny haha. They aren't anti-lessons anymore. They're meant to be taken seriously with no sarcasm or backhandedness about it, which becomes even more infuriating when you notice how overwhelmingly obvious these new messages are. And for those that haven't watched season 2 yet, I know you might want to think, come on, it can't be that bad. The conflict of episode 4 is solved by Joan admitting she enjoys basic things and that she was just as bad as popular girl Cleo by spreading a rumor about her, so she shouldn't consider herself morally superior. Does it sound like I'm describing Clone High right now? I'm not about to say psych, this is the real resolution to an actual episode. It's the exact kind of plot and lesson you'd expect the series to mock for lacking any substance, but somehow this comes around to being a 100% sincere message, and it doesn't stop here. No, not at all. This virus of sincerity has infected every element of Clone High satire, and I do mean all of it. Those fake-out emotional moments using licensed music ironically, boom, now they're actual emotional moments pertaining to actual drama. So the licensed music is being used earnestly. The parody-like celebrity cameos? Do you even need to ask? Of course they're more serious now. Or at the least, they're not nearly as farcical or mocking of the personalities as they used to be. Ian Ziering might show up for a dumb reason and get beaten up in a monster suit, but at the end of the day, he's still full of goodwill in a totally frank, non-sardonic display, promotes the encouragement of teen mental health, and includes a phone number in the episode that redirects to his website. And that's when it hit me. Clone High Season 2 isn't a satire anymore. It doesn't have a cynical edge. The showrunners might claim otherwise, pretending they've still got the sharpness Season 1 had, but in reality, all this season does to differentiate itself from other dramas besides being animated is that they like to make little meta jokes every once in a while, look directly into the camera and tell the audience that they're self-aware. But they're not. Just take a closer look at the story Ian Ziering appears in. The premise of the episode is that, by creating a test to make the clones stressed, the board of shadowy figures can release a monster to feed on their anxiety, and that's probably the element the writers will point at and yell, "See, we're making fun of common stereotypes." But if you pay closer attention to the content of the episode, while its presentation is in a comedic fashion, all the clones' anxieties are treated with a level of serious imagery. It's lighthearted about some of their fears, sure, but the intended effect is still that you care about their stress and recognize, with the help of Ian Ziering, that we should care about teen mental health and let out emotions instead of bottling them up. There's no mention of how substandard and bare bones the message is. They just do it with a semi-sarcastic attitude as a substitute for being satirical or funny. Haha, would you look at that? They're giving a detailed description of the problems with sex education in America, but they say that Pennywise from It is horny, so that means it's satire, and not at all a ham-fisted, spoon-fed info dump. My god, it's all so dated. I shouldn't be saying that about a series that just finished airing this year, but seriously, if you wanted to represent the moralizing, humorless, wannabe substantive, but lacking any nuanced TV that we've been getting for the past few years, this would be a great example. In 10 years, if anyone ever brings this series up in conversation, they're gonna know the exact year it came out. And my best theory for why they made it this way was all for the sake of some vain ploy at
Secret government employees.
And no character helps illustrate that idea better than Abe, who felt like his whole existence this season was written as the angry revenge of someone who got into the show after 2020. And look, I'm not trying to gatekeep by claiming everyone that started watching the series after a certain time aren't true fans or whatever, but for anyone that's paid attention to the fandom since its big spike in popularity, you do have to admit, with that sudden influx of fans came a subsection that didn't quite get the show's allure and treated it like a regular teen drama. You get what I mean? There were the types that got invested in the fake drama, shipped Joan and JFK together, had an obsession with the one-off character of Van Gogh for whatever reason, and most importantly to what I'm discussing, hated Abe with a burning passion. Why? Well, for anyone that's watched the show, they know that Joan has a not-so-secret crush on Abe that she bluntly admits to him every other episode, yet Abe never notices, no matter how straightforward she is. So certain fans started getting bothered by it, thinking he was neglecting Joan. And for anyone that did or still currently thinks that, I've got news for you. Him never figuring it out was the point of the joke. Abe in the original series was a representation of the insecure everyman protagonist teen dramas often had. And a dumb recurring theme of those characters was that they'd be woefully oblivious to their female best friend who was definitely into them. So, as Clone High does, they decided to mock this concept by taking it up to 11, making it so Abe was oblivious to literally everything. Cleo goes on TV and grinds on Ashley Angel from O-Town. He notices that she's not wearing the jacket she promised to, and when he sees that she was actually wearing it, he's completely fine with what she did. That's where the main source of his comedy came from. Abe's cluelessness was his charm, but this season you can tell the writers couldn't comprehend that idea. Interviews expressed that many of the new young writers were full-on angry at Abe for quote-unquote being mean to Joan, and that's shown in how the characters talk about Abe's behavior from season 1. He even describes himself as having ignored Joan's feelings in the past, but that was never his intention. Abe wasn't neglectful, he was ignorant of any feelings Joan might have had for him. The two were still close friends in the first season who tried to help each other however they thought was best, usually leading to comedic outcomes. It wasn't a matter of him neglecting her, that's a dumb fan observation, one that ironically channels the exact kind of cluelessness Abe was known for having. But no, Abe was in the wrong the whole time, so he's gotta get shit on over the course of the whole season. He has to apologize to Joan all the time when she's almost always just as in the wrong. At one point, she goes as far as to cut off Abe entirely after he tries to protect her feelings, implying that he needs to stop being so childish when it got me doing it. It almost had me go into detail about all this forced, artificial drama it keeps heaping onto the series, a decision I'm certain was also an attempt at appealing to newer fans. But no, I'm not gonna do that. I refuse on a philosophical level to participate in some thoughtless discussion of drama for a series that was never meant to genuinely have it. All I'm trying to say with this section is that there's an annoying stigma against Abe this season that's palpable in all the shit he takes. And what makes it worse is that none of the new writers have a clue how to
Juggle famous guys and ladies.
But Abe isn't the worst in that regard. His mischaracterization was more a result of not recognizing the early aughts trope that he derived from and getting angry at it. Cleo, on the other hand, is a whole nother story entirely. Similar to Abe and Joan, this season she's been put into a different position than she would normally have, no longer holding the title of most popular girl in school. But really, when you think about it, she's lost way more than that. Abe is going after Joan instead of her this season, so their relationship stuff is done, as is her comedic love rivalry with Joan. JFK is also dating Joan now, so there goes Cleo's main fallback option. She's basically been left no reason to interact with the rest of the cast or engage in any given conflict. So how do you think the writers got out of this conundrum they put themselves in? By completely changing her personality to fit a more stereotypically modern role. And dear lord, it is not a smooth transition. It was hard to tell that she'd changed at first, seeing as she had virtually no presence across the entire season, but in the one episode dedicated to her, The Crown, Joan Coming, It's a Cleo world, the show gives us a wonderful demonstration of everything wrong with the way she's portrayed in order to fit with this modern setting. They turned her into a fucking Valley Girl mixture of Regina George and Cher Horowitz. She's completely brainless, two-dimensional, mean for no reason, and none of it is accurate to what Cleo was in season 1. It's true she was vapid and artificial, that was always a part of her character, but she wouldn't express those traits with a line like, "I can get by with my looks alone." She wasn't so dumb that she'd proudly exclaim her own narcissism. In fact, she used to be smart. Are we gonna forget that one of Cleo's main skills was that she knew how to manipulate guys to do what she wanted using her beauty? The Cleo that led people on with implications knowing she'd never do anything for them? You're telling me that girl would feel the need to tell you she's hot? Bitch, she already knew and used it to her fullest advantage. That's part of where the satire surrounding her character came from. She was a gorgeous popular girl that hooked up with the jock, but she loved the everyman and had a functioning brain. Whereas this Cleo isn't a satire or subversion of anything. She's straight up a modern version of the common mean girl stereotype. I've seen this exact persona before in clips of Riverdale. You know, the kind of series Clone High was created to mock before it assimilated and started copying the homework of. And unfortunately, this writing disparity isn't limited to Cleo. Joan's been affected too, becoming the most insufferable, petty idiot ever. She's lost any semblance of self-awareness, angst, or introvertedness she once had to become someone that's nearly unrecognizable from her first iteration. How bad, you say? Here are a couple quotes that Joan actually said over the course of season 2. You know what keeps my mind off that? My boy toy JFK. I never thought I'd be with a popular himbo. I don't need songs to tell me when to dip. I'll dip when I damn well please. I missed your unreasonably sized booty. This will go on forever if you let it. I've got way more quotes than I'd like to admit, but you understand what I'm saying. The old female characters have lost a majority of their subtlety to appeal to a modern demographic, forgetting that these characters are supposed to be satirical by doing so. Now, in the show's defense, you could make the excuse that it's intentional to be with the times, which does seem to sync up with how the new showrunners want to bring the old clones into the contemporary present, but that's also kind of confusing, as much of the season has to do with the 2000s clones interacting with new clones they don't understand. So isn't it somewhat of a contradictory paradox that they don't get modern culture, yet they've seemingly adapted to and become less interesting stereotypes of that culture without noticing? I sort of confused myself with that sentence, but however you want to describe it, the characters are still butchered, and I'm not gonna lie. That's really funny, considering that this is the same show that, in its second episode, made fun of the way the first season wrote girls as if they were gonna do it better, and unequivocally ruined them. But wait, what am I saying? That's not true. The character assassination doesn't stop at the girls, it just takes a different form for...
Made I'm using genetic copies.
So, as you've hopefully realized by now, it's pretty apparent that all of Season 2's attempts at modernizing characters didn't come from a place of earnestly trying to update parts of the cast to better satirize modern TV, but instead were a stupid effort at giving them depth without comprehending why the characters work to begin with, inadvertently removing their nuance. So how does JFK differ from that, warranting his own section? Well, in this case, it's less about distinctness, more about combining ideas I've already covered. He's been changed from his original character, like Joan and Cleo, but the main reason for why is so he could better appeal to fan outcry, like Abe. The only difference between the two is that here, rather than being excessively hated, JFK has become adored for how he treated Joan in the final episode, which has led to people putting him on a pedestal as the one she's meant to be with. Thus, in this season, he's been given a far bigger, positive role as her lovable boyfriend. But in doing so, the way I see it, the showrunners are missing a primary charm of his character by changing his role as much as they have and giving him so much screen time. Not to imply that JFK is one note and therefore doesn't deserve his spot in the sun. After all, he's the one included in the most memes aside from rest in peace, but in the end, his range for jokes can be a tad limited, mostly having to do with his status as a Kennedy, the silly way he pronounces words, and his general lack of tact as a jock that's looking to get in everyone's pants. You never get bored by a specific style of comedy in the first season though, since the writers knew how to space his appearances out in a way that kept him refreshing instead of repetitive. However, as I'll get into in a later section, Season 2 is way worse at pacing overall, so JFK, as a super prominent character this time around, gets more screen time than the writers feasibly know what to do with, and that wouldn't be too much of a problem if we were talking about Season 1 JFK, as he did have moments of breaking from his traditional line of humor, but this isn't the original. This is the fan-altered version, who, in the process of becoming idolized, has lost his womanizing, insensitivity, and jockishness. So, as you can imagine, it shortens his comedic range even further, limiting him to almost nothing but ironically bad jokes. And the funny thing is, if they kept those original traits of his, it could have easily led to multiple absurd conflicts as Joan and JFK, these characters who should be so opposite personality-wise, seek out a relationship. A side we did get to see a portion of in the last episodes of Season 1. But that potential is wasted due to the writers not wanting to keep the negative attributes of a character that's beloved by the fans. So they were removed to possibly make him more likable, and along with those traits went much of his personality. The same can be said of Abe's obliviousness, Joan's angsty goffiness, and Cleo's cleverness. They were all played down, thinking the character's appeals lied elsewhere, but if how this season ended up is anything to go by, they couldn't have been more wrong. Every alteration they've made to the original cast reeks of misunderstanding Clone High at a basic level. And trust me when I say this, you haven't seen nothing yet. Alright, so if you've been paying attention, you may have noticed that I haven't said a word about the new clones to have come around for this season, and that's for two simple reasons. One, I wanted to keep a chronological, sectioned off, and organized kind of formatting, and two, in nearly every regard, they're far worse than the altered originals, being indicative of much bigger flaws. And yes, that includes Frida, a character who, for the most part, hasn't gotten nearly as much hate as the others. She's even received a couple of fans, and to be honest, I recognize why. Among the new clones introduced, she's by far the most decent as a character based on her own merits, having more to like than to hate and a nice design detached from the show. But much like how her design, in the context of Clone High, sticks out as not belonging to the world, Frida's personality has no place in the series, and the fact that she's here as she is shows to me that the crew lacks any level of self-awareness, because unlike all the characters from Season 1 used to be, there's nothing satirical about her role in the show or the archetype she belongs to. Frida is as generic an execution of chill artist that's knowledgeable on social issues as you can imagine, because the writers wanted to show that, quote, today's young people are smarter and have a better understanding of mental health. They're politically more intelligent. They're essentially more evolved and not just horny, which is a laughable statement when you look at how the season unintentionally portrayed her in Episode 1. It was the first instance in the series of the whole Abe getting the short end of the stick treatment I mentioned in his section, as it's an episode about cancel culture, and disregarding how unfathomably cringe that is for a concept, here's how it goes. After being unfrozen and finding out that it's been 20 years, Abe specifically, for some reason, is the only original clone who has a hard time adjusting and continually makes unintentionally offensive statements, leading to Frida, as the head of the inclusivity committee, canceling Abe, having the entire school ostracize him. And from there, the episode itself focuses on how Abe is hurt by Joan choosing these new friends over standing up for him, but there's an amazing opportunity for commentary and satire here that's absolutely wasted. It's never highlighted in the episode, so I don't blame you if you missed it, but if you noticed how in this situation Frida, and by extension the students who listen to her as the most popular in school, don't try to figure out why Abe says what he does or attempt to thoroughly explain what he did wrong so he can learn from it next time, but instead choose to excommunicate him from having a social life when he doesn't immediately get the ins and outs of modern sensibilities? I mean, hello, if the writers were just a little more open to the idea of making fun of their characters, this could have been a great comedic play on how popular kids today aren't much different from how JFK and Cleo were in the past, using their power over others to keep students they don't like from climbing the social ladder, showing that while outward personalities may have changed, their inner traits haven't. Plus, it would make Cleo and Frida's unnatural relationship later in the season make a whole lot more sense, seeing as deep down they'd be virtually identical, and as narcissists that only want the best, they'd naturally be attracted to one another. But as I said, that's not what happens, and none of Frida's hypocritical actions are implied to be intentional, so here's another idea. If they didn't want to turn her into a bully, they could have turned her into a conceited idiot. Here's my reasoning. Episode 4 opens on Joan and Frida working on a float that's meant to comment on greedy capitalism, and as the float's revealed to us, we can see that it's the most overt, overdone symbolism in human history. But weirdly, there aren't any jokes made about how unoriginal and cookie-cutter it is. There are jokes made in the scene that have to do with the float, technically, but as for the float itself and what it represents, we're meant to take it at face value rather than acknowledge how perfect of a chance it is to characterize Frida. Picture this. The episode opens with the duo working on the float, like the actual episode, but Joan asks Frida what the image depicted is supposed to mean, and she replies, "I don't know. I put so much thought and effort into this magnum opus, I'm not sure what we're supposed to take away from it anymore." Then the shot pans out to show the float, and she says, "It could have so many meanings. It's just that abstract, but I think it's a message about life, you know? Like, living is cool, and we shouldn't take it for granted." Scene end. And I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but that small bit would have done more for Frida than the entire rest of the season. It subverts any previous ideas we may have had about her in the episodes leading up by taking those thought to be basic personality traits of chill and knowledgeable and flipping them on their head, exposing that she's not smart at all. She's a pseudo-intellectual. Someone that, whether it be from ego or ignorance, believes they're smart and thoughtful, but they aren't. And subsequently, that could lead to other implications. Maybe she's chill in every situation, no matter the danger, because she can't discern what's dangerous and what isn't from being just that dense. Maybe she's been able to live this life for so long because she's popular, and therefore none of the students want to speak up against her out of fear of getting cancelled. There are several ways they could have made Frida a great character if the showrunners weren't too up their own asses to make fun of her. But I guess they had to be sacrificed so they could better portray the an element that's also been given physical form in the new clone's designs, which, look, I've been holding off on discussing these for the reason that they hold the most relevance to this section, but to put it simply, they encapsulate how the insertion of modern topics in Clone High feels. Totally out of place. Or in summary, they blow. And the thing is, I don't hate them for being modern. It's logical that characters from 2023 are going to dress differently than ones from 2003. Same as how a cast set in 2023 is going to deal with issues from that time. No, what I hate about these character designs isn't how they're different from the original main cast, it's that they don't fit into the world of Clone High at all. Aside from the glaring reality that several of them, especially Confucius, don't look anything like the historical figures they're supposedly based on, there are also too many unneeded details for the series' stylistic minimalism, whether it's Confucius's patterns, Harriet's clothes, or Frida's everything, and the new clones have way too many colors per character, making their designs all the more busy. They just stick out like sore thumbs in any scene that has all the clones together. And don't tell me it's too much to ask that we get some design cohesion here. I decided to log back onto
Twitter looking for possible redesigns, and I found several great ones that demonstrate how to portray the new characters as coming from the present without sacrificing their ability to fit in the world. I even found an interesting edit that updated the new and old clone designs to better fit with the modern times. And they're small alterations, but just like the edits I found of the new characters, they achieve the same goal of helping the cast fit together. And that only strengthens my point that it's not the intent of being modern that doesn't translate well, it's how those changes have been executed. See, from a glance, it could be assumed that updating Clone High to fit with the present day in the first place isn't tangible due to how inherently of its time the first season was. All the stereotypes the cast embody and the situations they get into are, as I've said, direct satires of popular teen dramas from the late 90s to early aughts. So if the series is so rooted in those concepts, it does make you wonder how they could translate it to now. But I think it's actually pretty simple. The best case scenario for this season would have been to have the series' original 2000 stereotypes, as they were without modification, interacting with new clones that embody 2020 stereotypes. And it seems that was part of the idea they were going for this season, but critically speaking, what are the new clones? A theater kid, a chill artist, a wannabe popular kid, and Topher, who's sort of the exception, but I'll get to him later. My point is that a majority of them already existed back in the 2000s. The addition of them using social media and having smartphones does not immediately negate that fact. Whereas the version of Season 2 that I'm proposing would have a cast full of Tophers. Characters that first became stereotypes in media from the 2010s to 2020s. Shit like Riverdale, Euphoria, 13 Reasons Why, Sex Education. There's a whole new generation of common tropes and character archetypes that could be satirized, and Topher is the one instance of them doing it right, yet among the new clones, he's used by far the least. And the only time they satirize a modern teen drama, as far as I can tell, is in episode 7, intended as a parody of the series Yellow Jackets. Aside from that though, almost every episode has to do with 2000s people discovering the modern era in about as uncreative a way as possible. Ooh, people are more sensitive these days. You don't want to get cancelled by saying something that used to be acceptable but isn't anymore. Hey gang, you want to look at TikTok? But oh no! Someone has left a mean comment. Let us engage in an internet argument showdown. Huh? You guys aren't worried about tests? We better give you a crash course in academic anxiety. It goes on like this all season. And what's even more frustrating about it is that, similar to Frida, the actual culture shock of the OG clones is never used to its fullest potential. Rather, it's restricted from the writers not knowing how to do it effectively. Take episode 1 for example, the cancelled episode. It could have been an entertaining exploration of how sensitivities in general have shifted if they altered one aspect. Make every old clone act like Abe, not just him for the sake of plot contrivance. That could have been the building block for a great spin on typical "you've been cancelled" episodes, in that the new students couldn't all team up to cancel one person. They'd have to go up against an entire half of the student body, possibly causing some kind of internal civil war about what's getting worth offended over and what isn't. There could be students that stop caring entirely and shout the most offensive things they can think of, or others that get so paranoid everything they do could be analyzed and used to cancel them that they completely shut themselves off. Scudworth and Mr B could serve as neutral parties, having been around for both eras. There's so much potential for making fun of the concept if it were executed right. But the writers wanted to single Abe out, so to force the scenario into working, they act as if every clone besides Abe would get on board in a single day, including JFK, who has lines in this episode that directly contradict his character from season 1.
I like boobies and butts, any shape or size.
You know my policy regarding fatties.
But who am I kidding? How can I expect this season to remember its own continuity when it can't be bothered to keep the historical element of the series relevant whatsoever? Yeah, how exactly did we forget such a crucial element to the original series? The whole premise is that it's about the clones of historical figures living in their shadows, going to high school. And back in season 1, that wasn't solely used for one-off gags. It was a major driving force behind how the cast was characterized. Each one of them was at a different point on a spectrum. Gandhi and Joan couldn't handle the pressure of living up to their noble clone parents, so they intentionally decided to become the opposite. JFK and Cleo leaned into the positive traits their clone parents were known for, such as beauty or sleeping around. Then there was Abe, who, as the everyman, was stuck in the middle, wanting to be a wise problem solver like his clone father, but not knowing how to get there. This spectrum even translated to their popularity. There was so much thought put into it as a shaping element of the show, but here in Season 2, by contrast, Harriet and the other new characters have virtually nothing to do with their clone parents, save a few artificial things like Frida drawing, and Confucius wanting to be wise sometimes, but they're not really defining traits of their characters or ever expanded on in any meaningful way. Frida is chill, Confucius wants to be noticed and have some social validation. Neither of these personalities coincide with or go against their clone parents' known behavior. There is no relation. But worse than them, Harriet is a character who, on every level, you would never guess is supposed to be based on Harriet Tubman. What behaviors, actions, or visual indicators does Harriet have that match her clone parent in any way? As far as I can tell, there's only one character among the new cast who has anything to do with their clone parents, and that's Topher. But as I've been leading up to telling you, the showrunners did him so dirty. And what I'm talking about when I say that is, if Frida was the character the writers were too clueless to capitalize on, Topher was the one they knew how to use, but somehow messed up in the latter half. In the first 2 episodes, he had everything going for him. An amazing design that, unlike the rest of the new clones, felt right at home with the original cast. A meaningful connection to his clone father in that he's so ashamed of his origin, Christopher Columbus, that he shortened his last name. And a personality that bounced astoundingly well off the original cast, concealing this powerful hidden rage beneath a calm mask that's overly adamant about saying he's a good person, when really, he's an unhinged gremlin. On all accounts, he's the answer to every one of my critiques towards the new cast. So how did they fuck it up? Well, he gets 6 total minutes of screen time over the course of the whole season. For anyone curious, that's about 2%. And after episode 2, that time is purely dedicated to just making jokes about how much everyone hates him for being a shit person. And to me, that is so lazy. They came up with this excellent character that works so well comedically and had such potential to be in funny scenarios as a socially conscious goblin that no one notices but is constantly on the verge of a freak out at all times. Hey, you guys ever wonder if they're gonna do a satire of episodes about school shoot? But making jokes around a character with that personality would have required a good amount of effort and consistent characterization to accomplish, so to skip the work, it goes for the easy way out by having him say shitty things to everyone so they can clown on him.
White silence is violence, I should be in the show.
And this confused me, since it completely contradicts how socially aware of himself he is in the first episode. Plus, doesn't making him a shit person everyone already hates kind of take away from the idea that he doesn't want to be seen as a bad person? If they kept that theme up of him always taking efforts to maintain his image, it could have led to one of Clone High's patented anti-lessons, where Topher gets so bottled up over hiding his true feelings, he eventually decides it's too hard and he should be himself. A terrible person. That would have made the ending joke where he's like, I'm done being nice. This is what I really feel. So much better than it ended up being. But you couldn't do that, could you, Clone High Season 2? You had to take the easy pot shots instead of putting in some elbow grease. And it goes way further than Topher. You never apply yourself at anything comedically. Why can't you be more like your brother? Season 1 was known for creating jokes that not only caught you off guard with how unexpected they were, but continued to build onto themselves, becoming funnier and funnier, always finding a way to get a bigger laugh. Take this series of jokes from episode 2, for instance. It starts with Joan and Abe walking to opposite docks to grieve, and the camera position makes you think they're at completely separate piers. But it gets you by showing that they're right next to each other. Then, amidst a humorous conversation about betrayal, Abe stands up, and you expect him to say he's hurt about Joan's behavior, but he was actually hurt from having stepped on a nail. Some more intentionally confusing dialogue follows, and you assume that the scene will end with Abe walking away dramatically, but he accidentally goes in the wrong direction, falling into the pier before getting back up and walking away. It's a scene full of bait and switches, catching you off guard multiple times right at the moment you think the jokes are going to end. And despite the fact I've seen it so many times already, I still laugh at it every time for the reason that it is just that well constructed. It's also a scene that wouldn't and never does happen in Season 2. Why? It's not obvious enough. It wasn't so on the nose you could see it coming from a mile away. I swear every joke this season is lifted from the Twitter feed of an insufferably annoying teenager. Are you ready for an episode that's almost 50% nothing but white guy jokes? Too bad, you're getting it anyway. Here's a scene of non-white characters pretending to be white and confident. Tell me, what do you think they're gonna say? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? I'll go ahead and tell you. You're right.
Vegas, baby!
Golden parachutes.
Storming the Capitol.
Golf!
Hey, how long you think they were in the writing room coming up with that little chestnut? I'm sure they were hunched over their tables, wiping sweat from their brows, coming up with that genius wordplay. But don't worry, they've got jokes that aren't safe. And by that, I mean they've got unnecessary gratuitous violence. And don't go to the comments screaming, blah, 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 season 1 had violence. I know. The difference is that when season 1 was violent, that was the joke. They hardly ever showed violence at all, so it would have a stronger impact when they did. Season 2 doesn't get that. It's got at least one overly graphic, painful looking violent scene per episode, and there's no context before it happens. There's no expectations set up for the sake of subversion. All they can do is point blank have something extremely violent happen and expect you to laugh at the very notion that it was violent. They are the reference jokes of visual gags. Though on that note, I shouldn't be forgetting all the references themselves in season 2, which are just as prevalent.
I tried to be supportive, like the principal in High School Musical. But then you go all footloose, like in the film Can't Hardly Wait.
This is the level of shit we're dealing with, people. That statement was pure gibberish if you weren't familiar with all of those movies. It's not a joke at all. And there are so many of them in season 2. So many. And once again, I want to emphasize that you don't leave an angry comment telling me season 1 had reference humor. I know it did. But first of all, none of season 1's reference humor was that obvious or highlighted. They were often background things that you wouldn't be distracted by if you didn't get it. And secondly, Clone High seldom directly referenced intellectual properties. It referenced historical shit to make jokes from that. And I don't know about you, but creating a 60s diner called the Grassy Knoll with a drink called the Jack Ruby Berry Blast probably took more effort than—
Aha! There's a Goonies clause.
Is it so much to ask they go for a gag that took more than 5 seconds to write? The closest we get to anything substantive is observational humor in episode 6, where Frida and Harriet comment on how 60s diners come from a time that wasn't great for everyone, so they don't understand why so many sitcoms have them. But aside from barely being a humorous observation, it's also stupid. Like, yeah, not everything about certain eras were great. So what? Does that mean we can't like anything from that time? Are we barred from celebrating an aspect of a period's culture that represented youthful hangout spots? You're dumb. That's dumb. This isn't a joke. It's a thinly veiled argument disguised as one. I shouldn't feel the need to argue with a pun. Though to be fair, it's arguably still better than all the boring, safe, unimaginative jokes, seeing as I've forgotten most of them the same way season 2 forgot how to structure itself. Have I ever mentioned how bad I am at segue? Okay, so considering each section of this video has been labeled by a character that represents a specific problem I have with the series, and we're currently on the 9th section, you can most likely piece together that this season has a lot of characters, some of whom are meant to replace Gandhi, others that aren't, but regardless of why they're here, our main cast has grown from 7 to 11, meaning this season is going to need to be way more selective with how it spends its time than season 1. And by this point, you should be able to guess how it's handled. The answer is poorly. As previously mentioned, Topher has none, Cleo barely gets any, and Abe as well as Frida get shortchanged pretty often so that JFK, Joan, Harriet, and Confucius can get way too much time for how uninteresting they ultimately are. And I think a major reason for this uneven screen time is a lack of defined roles. In season 1, every character felt as though they got the perfect amount of attention. And part of why it worked was that it clearly defined who would have what to do in any given situation. Abe was most often the protagonist, meaning that if a conflict didn't have to do with the entire school, it would most often be about him. Gandhi was the comic relief and best friend, so it'd usually either be alongside Abe or contributing to his own side plots. Joan was a play on the voice of reason or contrarian characters, meaning she was around as a straight man to the other's behavior. JFK would be the jockey instigator of conflicts, and Cleo would be the same as the popular item of affection, so they got slightly less. It was all really organized. But now with all of these new characters introduced, some taking the places of previous clones, others not having a defined role at all, the balance has gone off kilter, leading to several characters often having nothing to do in an episode or getting unnaturally shoehorned into roles they don't belong, altering their personalities on the fly. As far as the main cast are concerned, Joan has had her part in the series flipped, going from an outcast contrarian to a popular girl. So you'd think that would lead to fun instances of her not really caring about or getting annoyed by the typical stuff that level of attention would entail, as she never strove to be popular and seemed perfectly content where she was. But from episode fucking 1, she immediately changes her tune and starts caring about being popular over sticking by Abe, a line of action you would never expect the original character to do, especially as quickly as she did. And throughout the rest of the season, she's got this consistent, ever-looming fear that she'll lose her popularity, something she never cared about before. And in this situation, I can't grasp how it would matter to her now either. Frida and Harriet, the two main popular girls she becomes friends with thanks to her own popularity, were appealing to Joan specifically for the reason that they wouldn't look down on her for, say, having a medical condition. Why would Joan ever assume that she'd lose her popularity for that? Why has she lost any level of self-awareness in exchange for a weird level of self-consciousness? This isn't how we've known Joan to act at all. And would you believe me if I told you it only gets worse from here? Because it does. JFK, without his status as an antagonist, has been turned into a human lapdog for Joan that can barely function anytime he isn't around her. Cleo doesn't have anything to tempt her anymore, so they switch her into being into Frida for God knows why. Harriet, for lack of a naturally acquired role, was given the title of Joan's best friend, starting in episode 4 after giving no indication that she was any more important to her than Frida. Confucius is just there. And bringing us back around to season 2's weird hatred for Abe, his most common role in a given episode is to be made fun of in a way that, as you'd expect, completely contradicts his character. The worst example I can think of is in episode 5, where, with nothing else for him to do, he's painted as the prime example of a guy who's overly confident, despite having no talent, thanks to being white and privileged, while the minority characters need to learn to emulate it, and it is so forced for so many reasons. Like, Abe was never the kind of guy who was overly confident about anything. He was the awkward, oblivious everyman. If anyone was confident in the original series, it was Cleo, who was beautiful and popular, not to mention rich. She has a shit ton more advantages than Abe, so why is she included among this mismatch of side characters that have never interacted well in the series? Could it be that they lack a function too, and for this dumbass attempt at commentary to work, they needed a group of minorities? I guess that's what the side cast has been reduced to, with so little time already to squeeze in the main group. But of course, there were two members of that cast who got displaced worse than anyone else: Principal Scudworth and Mr. Butlertron. Back in the day, they were the characters you could count on to have a good subplot if the others were lacking. Maybe it would have to do with appeasing the board of shadowy figures, maybe it would be about trying to connect with the students and failing miserably, or fuck it, out of nowhere they might have a Looney Tunes parody. Whatever they did, you could be sure that as the genius comedic duo they were, complementing each other so seamlessly, you'd be entertained by their antics. But in season 2, there's one addition that totally disrupts that dynamic: Candide Sampson, an agent for the board of shadowy figures that comes in to watch over Scudworth, knowing he can't be trusted. And to be fair, on her own, much like Frida, Candide is an entertaining character. She's by far the least infuriating new cast member if looked at separately from the series, but as a part of the show, she completely throws off Mr. B and Scudworth's chemistry whenever she's around, which is most of the time. So whenever I see the three interacting, all I can think about is how much better the scene would be if she wasn't there. The best analogy I can come up with for what the new showrunners have done is if they took Abbott and Costello, added a girl for Abbott to swoon over, and then forgot about Costello in the process. A majority of Scudworth and Mr. B subplots this season, as short as they've become, are about Scudworth attempting to get Candide to like him, leaving Mr. B behind to commentate occasionally, but rarely have any significance or point beyond being there. And I think the writers kinda knew this, seeing as near the end of the season they gave an entire episode to Mr. B and Scudworth that's honestly better than the rest of the show. However, it doesn't help his lack of relevance for most of the season, and it's a great descriptor for how the show's pacing has been affected by all these changes. It's poorly spaced out, often leaves characters with nothing to do for long periods of time, has everyone constantly fighting for screen time, creating a bloated mess, and what's left of the characters is confused and barely reminiscent of their I think it's thematically fitting that, for the conclusion of this video, I name it after the character who unintentionally caused the series' conclusion 20 years ago. Oh Gandhi, how your lack of presence has been felt across this season, my friend. Abe didn't have a best friend, a lot of the side plots weren't nearly as interesting, the characters who came in to fill your place either lost their flair after a couple episodes or never had the potential to match you in the first place. But as I said at the start of the video, his absence isn't what keeps me from liking Clone High 2023. Gandhi is just one example of all that's missing from this quote-unquote second season for anything of it to be worth watching, let alone satisfying. It's a show that's lost its edge, humor, satire, self-awareness, historical relevance, complexity, balance. Shit, if it weren't for the visuals and character names, I'd have never imagined this was meant to be a sequel to the first season of Clone High. And even if the crew stays true to their promise of bringing Gandhi back if the series makes it to season 4, I don't think that's gonna change anything unless they take a step back from all of this and figure out what went wrong. I've been Just Stop. You've been a clone of Gary Coleman all along. Plot twist. Thanks for watching. See you all later.